This is the world ray traced with RTX on, and this is RTX off. Let's just turn that back on. There we go. So the problem with some of NVIDIA's RTX advertisements, the cards are out today, by the way, this is the review, is that they kind of show a picture of here's what RTX looks like, the SDK, ray tracing, global illumination, all these things, and then the comparisons are the developers just didn't enable anything, even traditional graphics effects, or at least didn't put as much time into it as they will by the time the game launches. So it's not really the best comparison, and the marketing leaves a lot to be desired. So then we, of course, turn to games. Benchmarking, looking at games that come out with, presumably, RTX features. And yet, here we are a day before launch, because that's when the reviews go up, and there are none. Before that, this video is brought to you by Be Quiet and the Silent Bass 601. The Silent Bass 601 is one of the quietest cases we've tested recently, laying claim to the crown of silence on our charts, and still manages reasonable airflow by shipping with a pair of high-quality fans. The 601 also uses well-designed panels and unique ease of installation features to streamline builds, includes well-placed dust filtration, and is large enough as a box to fit a full ATX build. Learn more at the link in the description below. First of all, quick announcement, we're going to do a live stream on launch day, or actually on review launch day. So that'll be the day this video goes live. If you're catching it the day it went up, their marketing for this launch, it's, man, what, did you guys like forget how to make charts? Because if we get a chart on the screen from NVIDIA, let's just look at the lines here. There's a line, it says 60 FPS, and that's it. That's the scale. It's unknown to 60 to unknown again. So yeah, the charts we had a problem with. They were completely useless. They did not tell us anything about the product. They were misleading. We don't know if the scale started at 0 or started at 30. And if you're talking about 4K 60 and acting like 4K 60 is some magical thing that's never been able to be done before, except by your own product last year, then we kind of have to question the intentions behind those charts. Final Fantasy 15's benchmark got updated. Actually, the benchmark specifically that we lambasted for being trash because it was misleading and had all kinds of, even after NVIDIA fixed NVIDIA and Square Enix, mostly Square Enix, let's be honest, fixed the Hairworks issues where it was being drawn when there weren't actually things with hair in the screen. There was still object culling, LOD scaling issues, and just general screwery within the FFXV benchmark, such that we wrote it off as completely invalid for testing. It's not really a game we can trust right now for an NVIDIA benchmark. So then we're left with things like the Asteroids Demo, which is very cool, but it's not a game. We're also left with the Star Wars Demo, which is cool, but we have no camera control, and it's not a game. Technologically, don't get us wrong here. The things NVIDIA is trying to do are impressive. The future of graphics will involve some form of deep learning, almost certainly for gaming. Whether or not that's here today, that's a different question, but NVIDIA is going the right direction, and the stuff they're doing is impressive. So marketing is making the product look worse than it should, because it's kind of just been a really messy, disorganized, sometimes misleading launch, and that's making the product look worse than it needs to. But we can't review something on promises. It's not how a product purchase works either. Don't buy stuff on a promise, but we'll continue talking about stuff certainly as it comes. Today we're reviewing the 2080 Founders Edition. We have a separate video coming up today on the 2080 Ti Founders Edition, and that'll have more information on that card. So what we're gonna do is benchmark games that exist on the market, which use rasterization only presently, because RTX, the namesake of these cards, is not a feature that you can yet use. However, the cards are still video cards, and they might in fact be significantly better than the predecessors, even in traditional games. Let's get into testing methodology and test results. So there'll be an article link below. Check that out for all this stuff, plus a bit more in detail. For testing overall, we picked each game based on the engine it uses and the API it uses, so they were selected for very specific reasons. We have a pretty good overall selection of games to cover most of the market. And then we also have the settings and the chart headers, to check those for graphic settings. For overclocking, there's a full overclocking section in here, but for the game overclock tests, we let the fan run at auto. So we relied upon the Founders Edition lookup table to do its own fan speed management, as opposed to just maxing it out, going 100% and hitting 59 decibels, because that didn't really seem realistic. So auto for the fan speed, despite being manually overclocked otherwise, and that was very intentional. One more methodology note here too. We're testing with partner model 1080 Ti's, 1080s, things like that, because we think that most of you will have those, and so it's the best comparison. If we use the reference 1080 Ti and 1080, the performance gaps would be wider because those coolers are garbage and the clocks are lower as a result. So it would certainly make the RTX cards look better to use reference versus reference because of the upgrades to reference, but we think it's more fair to use board partner, especially with dual fan, versus reference for the new cards, and that's what we're doing. Far Cry 5 uses the Dunya engine developed by Ubisoft Montreal. Far Cry 5 at 4K has the RTX 2080 FE card at 59 FPS average, planting it functionally tied with the board partner 1080 Ti that we tested at 57 FPS average. Our error margins on the graph define room for variance, but even considering that, the 1080 Ti performs functionally equivalently to the 2080 FE under these settings. The RTX 2080 gains on the 1080 FTW, non-Ti, by about 30% generationally, bumped up from 45 FPS previously. Vega 64 is in the same boat. It's about a 30% performance gain for the RTX card. For reference, the RTX 2080 leads the 980 by over 2x and leads the 980 Ti by about 63%. Overclocking the 2080 puts it at 63 FPS average, roughly equivalent, again, with the overclocked 1080 Ti. Here's a frame time plot of the RTX 2080 and the GTX 1080 Ti, as these cards perform functionally equivalently. They also make sense to compare when considering the advantaged price position of the GTX 1080 Ti's. Note also that a lot of NVIDIA's launch marketing for RTX has revolved around the word experience, in big quotes. Well, between these two, the experience is identical. There's hardly any performance difference across the cross-section of data we're showing here, and just as a reminder, frame time plots are to be read as time in milliseconds between frame presents, with 16 milliseconds equating a rough 60 FPS throughput. Lower frame time is better, but consistency is even more important. And here, they're both roughly equally consistent, so even outside of the sort of dated FPS metrics, the cards are the same. 1440p is next. At this resolution, the RTX 2080 FE runs at 105 FPS average, which places it as roughly equivalent with the 1080 Ti SC2. Again. Lows are also within our margin for error, marking frame times as roughly equivalent. Generational improvement over the 1080 non-Ti is 27%. The RTX 2080 has a bigger improvement at 4K than 1440, but not by much. As for Vega 64, this one, the board partner model, is running roughly equivalently to the 1080 FTW at just around 81 FPS. So more or less the same, given margin of error. Overclocking the 2080 FE to plus 100 and plus 800 landed us around 111 FPS average, with lows reasonably sustained and not suffering from inconsistencies. So that's good behavior from an overclock. And note again that the offset is not universal. So if you see plus 100 in this game, it's not the same as plus 100 in another game, because the clock that it boosts to could be different. And in this instance, plus 100 was stable in all games, whereas plus 160 was stable in some, but not all. Anyway, the 1080 Ti, that is, ends up tied again, even when both are overclocked. 1080p is interesting only for scalability purposes in Far Cry 5. At this configuration, the 2080 FE runs at 138 FPS average, or only 18.3% ahead of the GTX 1080. That's a significant drop from the previous gain, even at 1440, where the settings were shared. At 4K, we use different settings, slightly lower, in fact, and that illustrates further differences depending on anti-aliasing settings, and we'll look into that more later. The higher percent gains would also reflect to lower resolution, heavily anti-aliased scenarios, as you're sampling the screen X more times with anti-aliasing, thus producing the same amount of load on the render pipeline. The improvement to ROPS here produces much of the scaling difference between 1440p and 1080p at the same settings. Sniper Elite 4 has one of the best DirectX 12 implementations available, and was what tipped us off to Volta's shift to asynchronous compute performance on the Titan V. This game stands as a means to illustrate how modern APIs perform on cards with better asynchronous operation scheduling. At 4K and high settings, the RTX 2080 FE averaged 84 FPS average, with lows at 68 FPS for 0.1%. The GTX 1080 Ti SC2 managed 87 FPS when stock, demonstrating, again, near equivalence, but it is one that exits error margins. The Ti pulls ahead by 2.6%, overclocking both the 2080 and the Ti cards. The cards again face equivalence. We're at 91 FPS for the 2080 average and 89 average for the 1080 Ti, with 1% and 0.1% lows, both extraordinarily similar. The GTX 1080 non-Ti averages 66 FPS, allowing the 2080 a generational improvement of 28%. Not as large of an improvement as the Titan V led us to expect with this generation, but still an improvement. Unfortunately, that improvement also comes with a massive price hike and could be matched for a cheaper 1080 Ti. F1 2018 is next. This game uses the Ego engine and is built by Codemasters, standing as a good representation for other Ego engine games. Let's start with a different image. This is a resolution scaling chart for F1 2018, demonstrating the performance at 1080p, 1440p, and 4K high with the same graphics settings. The demonstration helps us visualize average FPS across resolutions. At 4K, the RTX 2080 is roughly equal with the 1080 Ti, which is actually not what we expected. We were expecting to see it to begin to pull away at the higher resolutions, and that's something we saw sometimes with the Titan V, but it does not appear to be reflected in this particular game with these two cards. At 4K, the RTX 2080 Fe performs at 81 FPS average with lows demonstrably low for all cards in this game. This is roughly tied in all metrics with the GTX 1080 Ti SE2. It would lead the FE 1080 Ti by a few percent, but that's hardly impressive, and we already said why we're not testing that. Overclocking both the 1080 Ti and 2080 results in another rough equivalence at 4K. Scaling from 2080 stock over the 1080 stock 59 FPS, we're looking at about a 30% jump, marking the largest leap we've seen generationally thus far. Interestingly, this particular title is a demonstration of thermal frequency response on the RTX 2080. When overclocked, we're running into a thermal cap limit and dropping frames pretty hard. Full fan speeds permit an additional couple of frames per second at the expense of 60 dBA of noise, so expect better gains on the partner models. Here's another frame time plot to help illustrate performance. We're comparing the 1080 Ti and the 2080, despite being identified by different names. These two cards are the most immediately similar in price. Again, the experience, in big quotes, is about the same, even when we look at frame times instead of frame rate. 1440p posts the 2080 at 134 FPS average, which is about 1.8% ahead of our 1080 Ti performance. Then again, standard deviation of the average is approximately 0.8 FPS, resulting in functional and observational equivalence. For scaling, the 2080 is 36.7% faster than the 1080, keeping the same scaling. At 1080p, scaling drops to 35%, which is still a big jump. This is an instance where the ROPS and FPU jaunt is largely beneficial, even in more traditional rasterization. For reference, the 2080 outperforms the 980 by about 120%, marking over a 2x gain across a 4-year period. The 980 launched in September, on the 18th actually, in 2014. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is next and uses an in-house engine for the developer. It's a modified Crystal engine. At 4K, we measured the RTX 2080 Fe at 54 FPS average, with the lows well-timed at 46 FPS for 0.1% and 49 for the 1% lows, inversely. This tightness of latency is a good path to a smoother experience. Overclocking allows the RTX 2080 Fe a lead FPS of 5 or 9%. For the 1080 Ti, we're at rough equivalence by all metrics. That's within error margins. The GTX 1080 runs at 41 FPS average, affording the RTX 2080 stock card a 33% lead. 1440p posts the RTX 2080 at 95 FPS average, affording it a measurable but imperceptible 2% advantage over the GTX 1080 Ti. Overclocked, we see the same behavior as before. The RTX card plants itself at 104 FPS average, or a lead of 6.7% over the 1080 Ti. That's not a guaranteed gain, mind you, and it does cost an extra couple $100. Scaling over the 1080's 73 FPS average allows the RTX 2080 a lead of 30.5%, and strictly to illustrate this point, here's a glance at 1080p. For this one, the gap between the RTX 2080 FE's 134 FPS average and the 1080's 108 FPS average shrinks to a 23.9% difference. The lead is dropping against resolution, as shown elsewhere. Note that we also observed a significantly higher standard deviation on the RTX 2080 overclock card than on any of the others. This was a result of the thermal limits being hit. It's not shown here, but we measured a massive standard deviation of 7 FPS on the overclocked 2080. For perspective, all other cards, including the stock 2080, had a standard deviation of around 0.5 FPS. GTA 5 gives us another fully populated chart and runs on the Rage engine. At 4K, the RTX 2080 FE manages 61 FPS average, marking it as below the 1080 Ti. We retested this twice, actually, and went for 10 total test passes for validation on the retesting for each device. Even with all the retests, the 1080 Ti SE2 is consistently ahead of the RTX 2080 by 5.1%. That is far outside of our margin for error in this game, and is a marked noteworthy improvement in the 1080 Ti, eliminating the RTX 2080 from consideration for this game. The value isn't there. Compared to the GTX 1080 FTW, it's about 29% faster, but being outperformed by a 1080 Ti overshadows this growth. At 1440p, we see more of the same. The 1080 Ti outperforms the RTX 2080 by 4.3%. The competition is better, except the competition is also made by nVidia. Vega 64 runs closer to the GTX 1070 Ti, down around 75 FPS average, and we'll skip 1080p because it's more of the same. The 1080 Ti outperforms the RTX 2080 Fe when using a partner model for the 1080 Ti, which is what most of you probably have. Overclock stepping is next. You already saw overclocking results, but that was for a frequency that was stable across all games. We also did additional testing where we found frequencies that were stable in just some applications, but higher overall. Here's our overclock stepping chart for the RTX 2080 Fe card. We learned a lot in this process. Full stock, we peaked at 1950 MHz and averaged 1875 while maintaining a temperature of 72 degrees or below. More on this later. The frequency pushed to 1890 MHz without any offsets when only increasing to maximum power throughput, or whatever was allowed by the card at 100%. As we began to increase the power offset and the frequency offset, we found that 2070 MHz was our average when under load and with a 100% fan speed. So this is all things maxed. Max fan, max power allowance, max voltage allowance, although even though Tom Peterson from nVidia says it's not a placebo slider, it kind of still is. Anyway, all of this is important, and Turing's frequency under Boost 4.0 is dependent upon thermals, just like Pascal. The all-time peak frequency here was 2115 MHz, but we ran into power perf cap limitations that did not permit higher frequency. It's odd, because if you watch BuildZoid's PCB analysis on our channel, the PCB and the VRM can withstand far, far more amperage. nVidia has limited Turing's overclocking capabilities and current throughput severely here, and in ways which are nonlinear with its overall improvements over the previous generation. In other words, even though there's 60 watts additional overclocking headroom in terms of power throughput, that is not a linear translation from the previous generation. We would expect more than that. Even though it's more, percentage-wise, it's not all that much more. Regardless, we also managed an 800 MHz stable memory offset, and these stats were only true while operating at 59.4 dBA with 100% fan speeds, mind you. Allowing auto fan speeds to take control, we hit thermal limits hard at 2040 MHz. A few of the cells in this chart are highlighted for thermal and frequency response. You'll see those tagged yellow. Just like Pascal, Turing drops clocks as temperature increases, even if it's well under the new 87-degree throttle point, up from the previous 83, 84-ish. We noticed that the temperature below 63 degrees, when it gets there anyway, would permit higher frequencies, averaging around 2070 MHz instead of 2055 MHz. We also noticed this trend apply at 75 degrees Celsius diode temperature, pushing frequency down again to 2040 MHz and then modulating between that and one step up. Speaking of noise, here's a chart of the RTX 2080 Founder Edition RPM-based fan noise. We'll show comparative noise-normalized thermal data versus previous generation 1080 Ti coolers momentarily. The fans have a maximum fan speed of approximately 4200 RPM only when bursting up, but will stop and stay at 3700 RPM when manually set to 100% and left alone for a second. The minimum fan speed on the FE card is 41%. You cannot go below that. It does not have a zero spin mode, which is about 1500 RPM. At the minimum fan speed, we observed an idle noise output of about 34.8 dBA in a room with a noise floor of 26 dBA. Pretty damn quiet. We measured 40.3 dBA at 52% fan speed, which is the speed we use for noise-normalized thermal testing that we'll show in a moment. At 100% speeds, which are required for peak OC performance, we measured a noise level of 59.4 dBA. That's pretty damn loud. That's about where Vega is for the reference card, about the Titan V, about Titan XP. Most commonly during gaming workloads, the card will operate maximally around 44 to 46 dBA depending on how hot your case is, because it will boost depending on that. For perspective, we also have this chart, a different one, to illustrate where NVIDIA's fan curve stands in comparison to some of its previous products. The RTX 2080 Fe fan curve versus acoustic response is less aggressive than the overly loud Titan XP and the desperately hot Titan V coolers, sitting closer to the 1070 Fe cooler in comparative data. Moving into thermal testing, we'll start with the frequency thermal response on a full stock RTX 2080 Fe card. This is data for a card that hasn't been torn apart and is exactly as you'd receive it from the factory with no changes to anything. Over a 30-minute 3D Mark test, we observed frequency decay at key temperature thresholds, with drops primarily around the 60 to 63 degree mark and again in the 70s. You can see a slight frequency falloff from 1965 MHz to 1895 MHz by the end of the test, which is normal behavior for NVIDIA's GPUs with Boost 3.0 and, as we can see now, 4.0. This chart, a different one again, shows the fan speed versus GPU core thermals. The fan ramp begins late, starting at around 68 degrees Celsius for core temperature. After that point, it ramps to about 1800 RPM and remains there as the GPU is within operating spec for the fan speed versus temperature lookup table. It'd go higher if the GPU core ran warmer, like it did in firmware. Comparatively, noise-normalized thermals for the RTX 2080 Fe aren't completely terrible. Keep in mind that this card draws a lot less power than the Ti, which we'll talk about momentarily and then again later, but still is relatively power hungry in some. And for clarity, Ti there is in reference to the 1080 Ti, not the 2080. We don't presently have the other RTX device data, but we'll be adding add-in board partners as we test their cards. For now, we offer an incomparable comparison against previous generation designs, strictly for some perspective. The RTX 2080 at 40 dBA of noise for all devices manages a reasonable GPU temperature of 49 degrees delta T over ambient. We monitor ambient temperature second to second and calculate a delta, mind you, so this is closer to around 72 degrees in hard measurement. That puts the 2080 as better than the dismal 1080 Ti Armor and Titan XP blower. The Titan XP is the most direct comparison. It's a large, high TDP device made by NVIDIA with an NVIDIA reference design, and it's beaten thoroughly in thermals by the 2080 Fe despite being a different GPU core itself with different die sizes, so that matters. Again, you can't strictly compare these things, but for purposes of getting some perspective on NVIDIA coolers generationally, it does help. The Fe runs significantly warmer than most of the 1080 Ti partner models, but is also completely different. So anyway, use the results as you may. The point is, though, that board partner cards will do this a lot better, most of them, and we'll look at those soon enough. For VRM Mosfet temperatures, we stuck thermocouples all over the card and measured a VRM Mos temperature from the hottest center Mos of about 46.9 degrees Celsius over ambient, making this better than the Amp Extreme, 1080 Ti Armor, and the Titan V, but worse than all the partner model TIs from last generation. Finally, VRAM temperature is completely incomparable in a like-for-like, as we're now looking at GDDR6 rather than G5X. For this, we measured a temperature of 57.2 degrees delta T over ambient, which is within GDDR6's operating range and is reasonable. So getting into the conclusion then, quick note on power consumption. We did just an ad hoc current clamp on the PCIe connectors, didn't measure the socket, so we don't know the power coming out of the PCIe socket. But for the connectors, the 2080 Fe sticks at about 15 amps and locks there for PCIe input, and it does not move. So that's partly Boost 4.0, it's partly a power or current limitation, and you can go past that with overclocking, but otherwise 15 amps multiplied by about 12.2 on that power supply to get your wattage. The 1080 Ti SC2 that we tested was closer to 16 to 17 amps, so it's actually more power consumption to get equivalent performance to the 2080 from the PCIe connectors. What we don't know is, did the slot change? Because if there's more power coming out of the PCIe socket, then it's kind of a wash, but we'll look into that more later, perhaps. So that's the power behavior. The card as a whole, look, it's, as stated in the beginning, it's easy to get carried away with disliking everything about the RTX launch because of how disorganized NVIDIA was in its public presentation and how misleading a lot of the charts were. And that, I think, has pissed off a lot of the community. There is also existing concern that is deep-rooted from potential hardware lock-ins. How well does Pascal do with these things? How well does AMD do with these things? The answer, if RTX SDKs ever get used, is probably not very well, depending on how they're implemented. But this is all stuff we know. And so there are a lot of reasons to be concerned about the product and about the launch and about RTX in general. The card even if we 100% ignore all of those other reasons, ignore marketing, every problem you've ever had with NVIDIA, put it all aside, how are the cards? And the answer is the RTX 2080 Founders Edition is not worth buying today. It's more expensive than a 1080 Ti partner card. It's hotter than a 1080 Ti partner card. Power is more or less a wash. And the gaming performance, it's identical. So there is a generational gain, 2080 to 1080, yes. It's also a price gain. Look at the Ti. We'll talk about this more in the Ti review. But the 2080 Ti, $1,200 for the Founders Edition and most partner cards. Technically, yes, there's a $1,000 MSRP. We don't know anything about those cards right now. Most of them are $1,200, and the Founders Edition is $1,200 as well. That's what you're buying to water cool most likely. So $1,200 versus a $650, $700 1080 Ti in the US that's absolutely available, we checked. That's something like a 60-70% price increase, and the performance increase is closer to 20 to 30. And we'll talk about that again more in the Ti review. So how do you justify that? Where do you find, the only justification is buying on a hope that you can use all this cool RTX stuff, and that also the game developers don't just keep doing what they've always done and make the games look pretty damn good and cheat the effects and do things like cube maps in the windows to make fake reflections, stuff that's tricked people for a long time. So there's a lot riding on hopes for RTX. The performance versus the price is absolutely not there right now. The 1080 Ti is the biggest competitor to NVIDIA's RTX product launch is NVIDIA's previous product, which is the 1080 Ti. If you're considering a card in the performance class of a 2080 for, I don't know, $800, maybe if you're lucky, a bit lower, but we don't know what the prices are going to be on the partner cards yet. If it's 800 plus, and you can get a 1080 Ti for $650, get a 1080 Ti for $650, unless you're maybe a developer. This is where it gets different. Game developers, not even production users, just straight game developers, or someone who's maybe working on movies or high-end 3D effects, stuff like that. Those users, it makes sense. And they need to adopt it anyway for it to make sense for gaming users. But for our audience, for Gamers Nexus, it makes more sense, generally speaking, to buy a 1080 Ti and not buy based on promises and hopes. And that's going to be our stance on that one. The partner cards might change things. We'll look at those. And on the development side, we will eventually look into that stuff as drivers are released, as Unreal Engine updates. We have the ability to do 3D modeling and ray tracing and all this stuff in software. And as Blender updates, Unreal updates, we plan to revisit these cards and look at them from a production standpoint. But today, from a gaming standpoint, is what we can look at, and it's not quite there right now. So perhaps in the future, perhaps as these technologies actually get adoption, I don't think this is really surprising to anybody. The performance is good, the performance is uplifted. The products are good objectively in terms of performance. The value is terrible for the 2080 Ti and is questionable at best for the 2080. The 2080 is more tenable versus a 1080 Ti than a 2080 Ti is versus anything else, 1080 Ti or 2080, because they're the same card. So in terms of performance. So I think that'll wrap it for us. Performance gaps will increase as we start switching to things like EVGA's cards and ASUS's cards, because they're going to be pre-overclocked, they'll have more power headroom, so the gains there will be more significant. The price might also be more significant. We'll visit that soon enough. But for today, we're comparing what you probably have, which is an aftermarket or board partner Ti 1080 versus these, and then we'll get into the rest later. So anyway, that's it. Kind of weak overall for the availability of what the product's namesake is, but so be it. It'll come out eventually, probably more likely than things like, I guess, VXAO. But that's it for this one. Subscribe for more as always. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to pick up a mod mat to support us directly. These beer glasses will be back in stock pretty soon, hopefully this week. And then remember, we have a live stream today, the day this goes up, at roughly 6 or 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time in the US, and that will be overclocking for the cards. So subscribe for that. I'll see you all next time.